Hi friends, I'm going to try something a little bit different, a longer video. Let's see if this works and I can post it. I was looking back on an article that I published with Richard Twine in the ecofem.org journal. 20 years ago I wrote an article that was replying to an article that Richard Twine had wrote. And looking back on it now is sort of like, have you ever written something that included your like your 20-year goals, and you looked at it, see what you thought 20 years ago? About a lot of things my views have changed, but about most of this, remarkably, I'm still on the same trajectory. Anyway, this was published in 2005 in Richard Twine's journal, ecofem.org, and it's called Reflections on the Masculine Hegemon, a reply to Richard Twine. It has my bio this is published in 2005. It shows me as legal director for Friends of Animals and a member of the adjunct faculty of law at Rutgers University, Newark. So Richard Twine asked why there are no direct action groups of men against male dominance. And it appears that Twine's question is still ahead of its time. I was probably writing that in 2004, it's getting published in 2005. In our time, global politics could hardly be less feminist. Some know the work of Vandana Shiva, some are acquainted with the writings of Arundhati Roy, but who is not familiar with the violent visions of G.W. Bush or Osama bin Laden, or with images of pitiless prison guards, bulldozers, blurred suspects on cameras in the London Underground? Today, the idea of power is associated not with life-affirming qualities, but with monstrous authority. The most recent competition for the position of the world's leading military supremacist, yes, I did mean the President of the United States, was a puerile yet sinister duel between candidate John Kerry and the incumbent Bush. The peak of their public rivalry featured Senator Kerry coming back from a hunting trip, armed and wearing camouflage, a member of the entourage following and holding a limp goose by the neck. Kerry smiled for the snapshots, empty hand overhead with an upwardly pointed thumb. Bush had earlier announced a state of armed conflict, essentially an international police action, without pausing for a declaration from Congress. The blood of the birds underscored Kerry's agreement with Bush that the U.S. may objectify, occupy, and kill to comply with a president's urgings. Geese assertively protect their nests and offspring, but they usually pose no threat of aggression. They support each other in times of stress, forging lifelong bonds. A competent pro-peace candidate was available. Ralph Nader and running mate Peter Miguel Camejo promoted peace, fair trade, and environmental activism. They got less than 0.5% of the popular vote. Images would emerge of detainees in Iraq, pictures of people posed in naked pyramids, a detainee on the floor held on a lead by a young U.S. soldier. But dissent was slammed under a tidal wave of red, white, and blue. Meanwhile, publicity experts for the incumbents, Bush and VP Cheney, constructed their own symbol for the other, footage of wolves, accompanied by narration linking the wolves to, quote, those who are waiting to do America harm. One of John Kerry's aides reportedly suggested responding with a scene in which Kerry, wearing camouflage, would shoot the wolves. The wolves served as voodoo dolls, representing the world of people not under the hegemonic control of the United States. Meanwhile, Alaska was issuing permits to aerial gunning teams to shoot the state's small tribes of actual wolves. Nature itself was something to drill. The Bush administration's ties to oil corporations is well known when a newscaster asked whether Kerry had been correctly quoted as promising to, quote, drill like never before. Kerry promptly replied, I'm also for the drilling in the 95% of the Alaska oil shelf that's up for leasing now, end quote. There was California's governor, remember Arnold Schwarzenegger, speaking at the Republican National Convention. After urging that, quote, we must be fierce and relentless and terminate terrorism, the governor brought the crowd to an ecstatic ovation by attacking Bush's opponents' meager faith in free enterprise and exhorting, don't be economic girly men. In 1998, an Associated Press article written by Lauren Neergaard called bonobos the feminist apes. Bonobos who live in the Congo River Basin are as closely related to humans as chimpanzees are. They have been noted for their capacity for altruism. Primatologist Frans de Waal said that, quote, we may be more bonobo-like than we want to admit, end quote. Well, I'd like to admit it. Drawing a bright line between the human species and the rest of conscious life has hindered us from learning from those outside the human sphere. It is possible to change our viewpoint. Noel Ignatieff, Rise in Power, observed the fluidity of dominance. In the 19th century, Irish people displaced from Ireland moved, quote, from being members of an oppressed race in Ireland to being members of an oppressing race in the United States, end quote. In other words, Ignatieff said, the Irish became white. They, my forebears, succeeded in changing the membership rules of the white social club. At birth, people are, as Ignatieff says, enrolled in that club without their consent or permission, end quote. That membership dictates whether they will be channeled into skilled work or into the army or prison or warehouse. If people resist, Ignatieff posits, people would zero in on class issues, quote, which would open the door for all sorts of social and political changes that haven't happened yet, largely because some people settle for being white rather than take a chance on being free. Ignatieff asserts that landing in the Americas meant being culturally mixed with a strong African influence. And yet most of us have been, quote, denying the Black presence within their own souls and hearts, end quote. Note the similarity here to de Waal's view that we may be more bonobo-like than some want to admit. The ideal to which we're supposed to aspire is white. It is male, and it distances itself from or subjugates the untamed, what's called the natural world. Whereas sympathy with the oppressed leads to charity, identification with the oppressed leads to justice or the demands for justice. To transcend racial prejudice, we must go beyond chivalry or sympathy. The key is identification. Ignatieff offers an example. Every person who looks white has heard race jokes. Even silent sympathy for the butt of the joke, claims Ignatieff, promotes white bonding. For an identification, Ignatieff suggests consistently responding, "Oh, you probably said that because you think I'm white. That's a mistake people often make because I look white." Ignatieff notes that when 5 or 10% of the currency is counterfeit, people lose confidence in it. Quote, "White skin is the official currency of this society," end quote. So if 5 to 10% of the people who looked white relinquish the identification, white skin would lose its value. And authority figures, quote, "would no longer be sure about how to perform their function," end quote. With racism thus disarmed, we'd create possibilities that could transform our culture. Left to its own devices, however, racism draws potentially radical working people into white supremacy and other similar movements. So now what can I tell you from my place in the intersections? I'm a jogger. I know what it's like to be taunted and intimidated on the road because I am not in the same category as the people who like to intimidate me. And I know that if I were perceived as non-human, an animal making my way along the road, I could be run over, chased openly, trapped, or shot dead. The animal cannot carry even a devalued form of currency. How do I transcend sympathy and actually identify with those of the animal world? And here I'll say I'm still on this exploration today. You can look at other videos on this YouTube channel and see that this past year, 2023, I became a committed pedestrian. I refused to drive. And a big reason why, the reason why, is my veganism. I don't want to present myself, to show up in the world as a danger to other animals anymore. Richard Twine described the idea of hegemonic masculinity as being in control of all that is placed under the term nature. So to relinquish the privileges of dominion would mean to consciously unravel our concept of man. Man, that is, a gender, a species, a bundle of invincibility and authority over nature. Man, the measure of all things, has constructed the definitions of sameness and otherness, and hence status. In Twine's words, ecofeminism is a decisive social movement since it is one of the first to coherently question this particular human. Historically, liberation movements have tackled dehumanization. So just think of the phrase, treating them like animals. But beyond dehumanization, I think liberation needs to be about creating new human identities. Relinquishing the controller identity will change one's perceptions of oneself and that which was the other. To begin, as Twine puts it, is to, quote, think emotionally about his relationship to nature, end quote. But, Twine observes, class struggles frequently focus on the heroic romanticism of taking on the system and enforcing social justice. The time I wrote this piece, 2004, 2005, was a time of swashbuckling displays. A time when spokespeople for animal liberation said, for an example, this is a real quote, and it doesn't matter who said it, it was fairly common at the time, quote, "I don't think you'd have to kill, assassinate too many vivisectors before you would see a marked decrease in the amount of vivisection going on," end quote. In this militant model, one would offer oneself up as a willing soldier pitted against the far mightier arms of government, ready to hurl one's body against the walls of a multi-billion-dollar industry, willing to be trained as a killer, and ultimately prepared to walk into court and submit to jail, even perhaps death. This willingness to see how far we can push hardcore activist rhetoric becomes, as I said then, to me, the equivalent of putting grease in one's hair and combing it into a pompadour. I am reviled, therefore I am. To me, the might makes right rhetoric loses touch with the cause and simultaneously draws public attention to the threats posed by activists rather than those posed by human domination over nature and the use of animals to achieve it. Rather than attempting to compensate for a loss of status by engaging in militancy, Twine's essay suggested, the one I was responding to here, activists could work at the common roots of all oppressions. The activists' capacities are challenged more through declining to compensate for what our society considers low status. So in Twine's view, the ecologically aware animal liberationist who is also willing to transcend gender restrictions helps to, quote, make less likely the existence of heterosexist socialists, patriarchal eco-warriors, and humanist feminists, and so on. In the 1981 essay, One is Not Born a Woman, Monique Wittig, Reisenpower, wrote, in order to be aware of being a class and to become a class, we first have to kill the myth of woman, including its most seductive aspects. I think about Virginia Woolf when she said that the first task of a woman writer is to kill the angel in the house. End quote. On the other hand, as Twine noted, there is a, quote, persistent Western association of women with nature, and ecofeminism is a strategic response to this, wherein activists pick up on the association, yet refuse to be demeaned by it. I, Lee here, would suggest that our understanding of feminist principles rather than our genitalia identifies us as feminist. And the same holds true for ecofeminism. To extrapolate from Ignatieff's relinquishing whiteness, in order to dismantle oppression, the male activist can and must have a way to go beyond sympathy and achieve identification. What does male mean anyway? And who wouldn't want to relinquish it? A bundle of social habits in motion, a way of playing a role, a form of acting according to received ideas, not the essence of someone's personhood. Now, back during the time that I wrote Reply to Richard Twine, I attended meetings of feminists, even before, a little before that time. I attended meetings of feminists for animal rights, also called FAR, as a member of the core group. The core group of feminists for animal rights would be parallel to what a lot of other groups call a board. For some months before I write about this back in 2004, 2005 in this essay. For some months before I physically met anyone else in the ecofeminist movement, I corresponded almost daily online. After we met in person, one of the group told me that they had not really been sure what kind of role to suggest for me in the movement because my messages online bore no stylistic cues hinting at my gender. I took this as a sign that I was doing well, freeing my patterns of thinking and writing from conventional roles. After all, haven't feminists taught the world that gender is a social construct? But at far, certain roles would be out of bounds for me if I had received a male upbringing. Now, the unease I feel with that situation does not discount the experience of being a member of a socially disadvantaged group. The experience of social disadvantage is not hard to get. Even if you're at the very pinnacle of high value personhood, you can devalue your currency by going to a foreign place and working as an undocumented employee. In the way I have explained above, jogging, being heckled, contemplating running as a non-human being, experiencing oppression enables one to identify with the dominated group and starts removing borders. The duality of otherness can't remain in place for this to happen. This is not to suggest, again, that the activist should ignore the disadvantages and the increased burdens that patriarchal society has selectively imposed. No one need put up with a male activist who talks and writes about fine feminist principles so much and so long that the copying, proofreading, cooking, and cleaning are left to others. It should be practically taken as a given that the notable female activists in one's midst have mainly come to that position after years of acting as support staff. Their gifts of time are dues that ought to be paid on a fair basis, and fair should be read generously by the patriarchy's consistent beneficiaries. That said, Twine rightly reminds us that patriarchy has also impoverished them. A male human being has become half a human being, lacking the richness of emotion that could have informed a life in which gender roles did not obstruct a full range of creative being. Twine also mentions male invincibility, that illusory concept sold to young people in films by Arnold Schwarzenegger. That myth imposes stress, self-denial, ambivalence about caring for the male body. This can be seen most starkly in war, where the soldier has to accept an injury as a badge of virtue rather than senseless mutilation. At the end of the essay, I have a section titled, subheaded, Putting the Ethics Back into Bioethics. Twine talks about the history of Western science and its approach to nature as exemplified and expressed through devaluing emotion, with methods that, quote, abstract, observe, isolate, control, and yet keep at a distance, that being examined, end quote. Twine calls genetic engineering, quote, striving for some form of pseudo-procreative ability, which would only appear to vindicate the charge of womb envy, sometimes directed towards hegemonic masculinity. In August 2005, around the time that the article I wrote was being published in Richard Twine's journal, South Korean scientists announced the first successful cloning of a dog, the latest in a line of clones, beginning with a sheep, of course we all remembered, named Dolly, was carried by a surrogate mother and delivered by cesarean section. Scientists lauded this, quote, important piece of research, end quote, with no apparent concern about the individual subject, or for a sibling clone who lived only 3 weeks and died of pneumonia. Laurie Zoloth, a professor of medical humanities, bioethics, and religion, declared, quote, this sort of work is a necessary first step to creating human stem cell lines and using them, end quote. Yet when asked if dog cloning might lead people to accept the idea of human cloning, Zoloff found it, quote, hard to imagine a way to set up that first safe ethical experiment. The rates of risk to the mother and to the baby would be unacceptable. Why? Why do bioethicists so frequently imagine that ethical barrier between species? It's unimaginable to breach that ethical barrier if it's human, but somehow dog, primate. A panel of primatologists, stem cell researchers, lawyers, and philosophers spent more than a year debating inserting human stem cells into monkey brains. Scientists in this panel admitted to being unsure of how to ethically separate humans from other primates. They didn't know, should primates be used for any invasive biomedical procedures? They didn't know. Still, citing Genesis, the panel's report stated, quote, humans are set apart from God as morally special and are given stewardship over other forms of life, end quote. Recall that influential people drew from Leviticus to perpetuate slavery. Were bioethics informed by ecofeminism at a stage where such information mattered? The decision-making would differ radically from the current paradigm, and the whole planet and all its life would not be seen as waiting around to be valued in terms of enriching a single species, man, the global hegemon. Human violence does not fit easily into compartments, nor are we likely to be relieved of it by regarding it in compartments. A violent culture systematically neglects the duty to teach its children respect for the autonomy of other beings, whether they be geese, wolves, or people outside the myriad borders we invent from culture to culture, age to age. A violent culture constantly looks for enemies. Any systematic form of domination and control perpetuates a paradigm that divides individuals into classes of oppressors and oppressed. It then claims this scheme is somehow natural and endless. Ecofeminism is an acknowledgement that disrespect for and maltreatment of nature is perpetuated by the very same thought process wherein human beings set out to dominate each other. Reconnection isn't easily accepted. It's systematically subverted by prevailing scientific, economic, and social values, and yet its promises are boundless. To paraphrase Noel Ignatieff, that kind of reconnection would open the door for all sorts of social and political changes that haven't happened yet, largely because some people settle for being white, male, human, rather than take a chance on being free.